I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give what will be my final contribution on this bill, and actually the Greens' only contribution in this debate today. As several other speakers have commented, I think the officials from the ministry did a really terrific job of working with the committee on this pretty technical subject, and they were praised highly in the second reading debate, but they deserve praise in this debate also. Simon O'Connor, in his contribution, remarked on the fact that this bill effectively has two purposes. One to bring New Zealand into line with our international obligations under the IAEA, and secondly to modernise. And Barbara Kuriga's just referred to the fact that this is legislation that's 50 years old, and I guess there's nothing like legislation that touches on science to expose fairly brutally how legislation can become out of date. And certainly the legislation that we are replacing is obsolete legislation. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, sometimes if there may be some value in some sort of systematic review of old legislation so that other acts like, for example, the Adoption Act, which is also well past its use-by date, could also be reviewed by this House. Mr. Speaker, I think the debates in the House on this matter and at the Select Committee have focused to quite a considerable degree on this business of whether or not the bill should cover only ionising radiation but also non-ionising, and several speakers in this debate have referred to that. The original recommendation from officials was that the bill should cover both, that all forms of radiation should be regulated through this particular statute. And there's certainly some sense to that. Putnell Williams, in her contribution, even though she didn't participate in the debate on the committee, I think has it right when she talks about there being a continuum of energy that radiation could potentially possess, and the difference between the amount of energy that something needs to ionise and that which wouldn't be enough to ionise at the boundary is just a hair's breadth. There actually is a continuum. But in practical terms, Mr. Speaker, there is more of a difference. And officials told us, I guess, first of all, that for non-ionising radiation, we have regulation that has been kept more up to date. As new devices become available, regulation has been put in place that has, in fact, protected the public from potential harms, although I think Enoch King is completely right to draw the House's attention to a bill that we have yet to finish debating that really covers an area, namely sunbeds and solaria, where a source of non-ionising radiation is able to produce the kinds of serious harms that are perhaps more worthy of the kind of strong regulation that this bill provides for. So, Mr. Speaker, the regulation of non-ionising radiation has kept more up to date than has the statute that on which we rely for the safety of ionising radiation. And I guess too that the qualitative effects are significantly different. That perhaps with the exception of the sunbeds and solaria example, non-ionising radiation is typically stopped and absorbed within the skin, and it's within the skin that any adverse effects are likely to be felt, whereas ionising radiation will typically penetrate the skin and cause havoc within the body by ionising cells within the body. and that ionisation, those particles that are produced by that ionisation process, will go on to damage DNA, causing either direct harm or potentially mutation that will cause harm down the track, sir. So both practically and in terms of effects, there are distinctions that can be reflected in different types of regulation. Mr. Speaker, there are nonetheless some odd effects that come about from having different regimes for dealing with the two types of radiation, and I've referred in earlier contributions in the House to the fact that in a hospital, for example, and other speakers have quite rightly referred to the fact that it's in healthcare settings that many of these forms of radiation crop up, that literally within the same radiology department, one will have an MRI suite and MRI technology that uses a form of non-ionising radiation that is regulated in a different way from what may literally be in the next room, the X-ray machine in the next room that will be regulated by this bill. There is an administrative inefficiency that is created by having different regimes for dealing with the two. So it's a difficult balancing act, I guess, to get this right. On balance, while at the beginning of this process I felt that probably both forms of radiation should be regulated by this bill, on balance I think that it's reasonable to have separated the two. Nonetheless, sir, the level of confusion in the public that exists around the distinction between these two forms of radiation and the subtlety of the difference, I think would have justified support for the change to the name of the bill proposed by Annette King. I believe that the bill we are passing into law today, sir, ought to have been called the Ionising Radiation Safety Bill. Mr. Speaker, I close by making reference to something that I think is probably always worthy of note when the House is debating a bill that has scientific implications, and that's the matter of scientific literacy, sir. The submissions that the committee received were small in number and mostly from people with expertise in the field, and some of those submissions were extremely useful. But one or two of the submissions reflected a lack of understanding of the science or a misunderstanding of the science, and I know that in some of the more general comment that existed in the community about this bill, such misunderstanding of the science was also present. And I worry, sir, that the internet, one of those technical devices that's, or technical apparatuses, shall we say, that has come into existence in the time since the radiation, in the 50 years since the original Act was passed, that the internet has meant that people have access to an extraordinary amount of information. And that information, sir, varies very widely in its quality between extremely helpful and authoritative information at one end through to information that is misleading and unhelpful at the other. And that has created a situation, sir, where New Zealanders, perhaps more than ever before, need to be able to discern the difference between the two. To know when we look at something that's on Wikipedia, for example, or that's found on some other website, whether the information there actually has a scientific validity. Because if we do not possess that science literacy, then we will draw conclusions that are invalid. And the contribution that we can then make to the debate about scientific matters in this country is compromised. So, Mr. Speaker, I close in supporting the bill, but also supporting the House doing what it can to improve scientific literacy. Thank you, sir.
Kia ora.